Hello, my name is Tyson, and in this video we will be going over troubleshooting the Steadicam Axis Volt. Now you might be watching this video because you're experiencing some of this strange fishbowl effect where the sled is just kind of spinning around and not settling its horizon or tilt. So I'll be going over a few things to check to help get rid of this problem. First and foremost is going to be just turning off and on the rig. So it's an electronics and sometimes they just need a power cycle. So try that first. Now, if that doesn't work, next we're going to take a look at the battery. So if you're low on power on the battery, it's not going to be giving enough juice to the volt for it to function. So maybe that just needs to be a battery swap. Now, if you swapped your battery or the battery is full on power, that's when I would say to start looking at how your accessories are drawing power up top. The monitor that comes with the sled doesn't draw that much power, but if you're flying a camera that draws a lot of power, that can be pulling some of that away from the volt. So I would disconnect anything up top, test to see if the volt can function. If it does function fine, then maybe it'd be good to change a power situation on the top stage. From here, you're going to want to check the gimbal index line. So on the bottom of the gimbal, there's a yellow line. You got to make sure that lines up right here on the post where it has another line. And that's going to help tell the volt where its calibration is for its horizon. Another thing to check is your volt cable. So here it is mounted to your top stage on the front and then onto the front of the volt drive. You have these tightening knobs, so make sure that they're fully secure. You don't actually need a tool for it. Finger tight is going to be tight enough. And while you're at it, I would remove the cables and check the pins. Make sure nothing is bent or broken or missing, because that can interrupt the communication between the volt control box and the volt drive. The last thing to address is balance. So let's say you're doing a lens swap or a filter change. It is always a good idea to go back to static balance and then neutral balance. If you try to just go directly into neutrally balancing, it can give you kind of a false reading to make you think that it's neutrally balanced when it's not. So I always recommend going back to static just to make sure, because that'll always be your foundation, and then going to neutral. On top of talking about balance, certain things that could be causing an imbalance would be the dovetail. So here on the top stage, if you find that the dovetail is sliding forward and back, that's going to mess up your fore and aft. To fix this, you would just open up the latch, slide the dovetail off, and then you can move that latch halfway, and then there's a hole in the middle where you can insert a 5/64 Allen, and you can tighten it up. Now, you only need to tighten it up maybe like 1/8 of a turn. It really doesn't need that much. So then put your dovetail back in, and if you try closing the latch and you're feeling a lot of pressure and it's not closing all the way, don't force it. Open that back up and try loosening that screw again. So you're gonna try to find that sweet spot. And then put your dovetail back in, close the latch, so you should feel a nice feeling of pressure to secure it. And then just for a last check, I would make sure that you can't slide the dovetail. Now, if you've tightened that latch as far as it can go and it's still sliding, that's where you can do a temporary fix of adding a piece of tape on the dovetail to increase its tolerance to hold it in place. Now, that'll be a temporary fix. I do recommend getting the sled service sooner to make sure that that gets addressed and fixed properly. From there, those are the main things that may be coming up and why you're seeing that fishbowl effect. If you're still seeing it after trying all those things, then I would recommend reaching out to the Steadicam service department, as they'll be best equipped to help you fix whatever problem you're having with your sled. Now, you may notice that while the rig is off, if you're panning it, it can feel like there's some cogging going on. And that is due to the magnets in the pan motor kind of aligning themselves and then unaligning as you're continuously panning and then realigning and so on. So that's that cogging that you're feeling. Now, even with the volt on, if you're still experiencing that, that might be due to having too low of a pan strength setting. So you may need to increase your pan to reduce that cogging feeling. If you're still feeling that, double check your sub menu for the pan for your inertia and drag, because you always need a little bit of that too, along with the pan strength, to ensure that your pan motor is going to properly function. For more information on that, I would recommend taking a look at my previous video, which goes over how to set up the volt system. Next, we're going to be talking about vibrations, okay? So I'm going to work from the top down. If you're experiencing vibrations in the camera, mostly like it seems like you can see the steps you're taking, that's when I would take a look at the build of the camera, make sure it's fully secure, your dovetail is mounted to the camera properly, Any of the accessories are fully tightened down. If you're flying a long lens, make sure that it has the proper lens support because if it's really long, it could be bobbing on the end of the camera. Working our way down, you have the gimbal. Typically, I don't find vibrations are existing because of the gimbal itself, but while you're there, might as well double check some of the screws, make sure your latch system is fully secure, things like that. Working our way down to the base, we have the rod system, so make sure that these are fully tight, as well as your monitor and battery. If your battery is sitting on there kind of loose, you can add a little bit of soft-sided Velcro onto the battery plate, and that'll cinch it up to increase the tolerance to make it secure. An added note, as I know vertical shooting is becoming more popular, you may mount your monitor vertically, but because it's extending out further, it could add to it bobbing and vibrating on the end of it, so make sure that's fully secure as well. Another note to talk about vibration is the arm socket to the vest when you're running. So I've noticed that when I run, sometimes the socket will swing back and forth and bang into the vest. And when it does that, it'll vibrate through the arm and then I can see it in the camera. And so situations like that, I may extend the sled a little bit further away from me while I'm running or adjust my position slightly to prevent that socket from swinging back and smacking into the vest. The last thing to touch on about sled vibration is the extension of the bottom post. So if this gets fully extended, I like to think of this as almost like a diving board. The further you go out on the diving board, the more it bows and vibrates, right? So it's kind of the same idea when it comes to the sled. Now, personally, I actually haven't experienced any sort of vibration issues with this post extended on the Axis sled, but I do know it has happened with other versions of older style sleds in the past. So to just reduce any possibility of vibration, I do recommend just closing this up as much as possible because you're just reducing the amount of possible vibrations that could happen with the sled. I do understand some exceptions need to be made if you're needing to shoot something really high or if you're trying to go ultra low mode, but generally speaking, try to keep the sled as compact as possible, as typically speaking, that's going to be easier for operating. The other type of vibrations you might be experiencing could be coming from the volt drive. So if you feel vibration coming from the top stage or the volt drive, that could be a situation of the particular type of camera build that you're dealing with. So the best way to deal with that is to start going through your dial settings and turning down your pan strength or your roll or tilt and seeing if that relieves that vibration issue that you're experiencing. And maybe that's going to be the only solution you really have unless you have time to address the build itself to see if that's actually what's causing some sort of reverberation through the camera, which then the control box is detecting and then adding to the vibration of the volt system. A real quick one is when you first turn on the rig in this position, and if I were to unpause the system, you're gonna see that it just locked at this tilt angle. It didn't go vertical. Now, why was that? And that's because when I turn on the rig, it is calibrating its horizon according to this index line, but it's also calibrating its tilt based on when the sled was turned on. So again, when I unpause that, it's gonna hold at that tilt angle. Now, you don't need to do a whole on-off process to get this to be perfectly vertical by here and then turning it on. From here, I would just hit your mode button right here, and now that has locked your new tilt angle. So just real quick and easy. When flipping the sled from high to low mode or vice versa, the manual states that it can take up to 10 to 20 seconds for the volt to find its horizon. The higher the strength settings you have, the faster the volt will be able to settle its horizon. A little trick that I do is once I flip over, I'll kind of push the roll axis a little left and right with my hand, and I feel like it helps the volt find its horizon faster. Now that's not in the manual, that's just something that I do. It might be a placebo, but yeah, if you guys want to give it a shot, let me know if it works for you. Another thing to touch on with balance in this position is when you flip over to low mode, make sure that you're not going to be top heavy up here now, because the volt system is simulating bottom heaviness. And if your sled is actually heavier on this side and not neutrally balanced, then the volt is going to be fighting that imbalance constantly, and it's going to reflect into your operating. So make sure you're neutrally balanced when you're going to be flipping from high to low mode. Now, an added note that this gimbal and volt system is not enclosed, so anything like dirt and debris and water can find its way in there. So if you're going to be in an environment where that might be an issue, you can use trash bags as a last resort to just wrap around the whole system to protect it. If you're looking for something a little bit nicer, I believe some people use camera DSLR weather covers because they give the access holes for the buttons and for the lens so they can fit relatively nicely around the bolt drive. So that's a possible option if you need something to look a little nicer around the bolt system. And 1001, 1002. All right. So I have statically balanced for a 2-second drop time pointing in this direction. I'm going to be doing a 180 test. So what that means is that once I point one direction with the 2-second drop time, I'm going to point the other direction and see how many degrees off does the sled go. Now, a conventional sled will be able to pass this test and maybe it'll go off a degree or two when you're pointing to the other way. The Axis sled actually tends to lean a little bit further than that. Now, that's not an issue for the Axis sled because the intention of this sled is to operate with the volt on. And when you're neutrally balanced, it may actually give that exaggeration even more, but the volt system is typically going to be strong enough to overcome that. Now, if you do like to fly the sled with a much lower setting, in particular with the tilt, that's where you may come across a particular issue, and I'll address that next once I move this back to neutral. All right, so now I'm balanced to neutral, and what you're gonna find is that when I pan over this direction, and I try to do a 180 test, you're gonna see it start to really drift off, right? Now, where this can be a problem with low tilt strength, so let's say we're operating, and right now I have a tilt strength of 2, so very, very low. It's actually gonna be pretty much neutral. You can see where it just floats, right? It is power going to the tilt, it's just not enough to overcome the weight and the amount of tilt inertia that the sled is experiencing. Now, you may notice that here, it holds really well, but once I pan 180 degrees, and if I were to release this, you're gonna see it start to tilt off axis, right? So this can be a problem if you needed to do a switch in the middle of the take. And this is where I really like the function of the presets or the scenes for the Axis sled. So for scene 1, I have a tilt strength of 2. And in scene 2, I have a strength setting of my tilt at 6. So what that means is while I'm operating in this position, as I start moving through my shot, I move over to Don Juan, and then I can click that button to go to scene 2, and now the tilt holds. So this may be a little workaround that you may have to do if you really like a low power tilt when you're operating in missionary, but maybe you're gonna need a higher strength of tilt when you're operating in Don Juan or Tango or Idle, whichever position that may be. But this is where you really wanna start utilizing the scenes to help with the operating and overcome that little bit of imbalance that the volt system might experience. On top of that note, I do recommend that when you are balancing the sled for static and neutral, you point the camera in the direction in which you operate. So I'm a regular side operator, so I fly the rig on my left side, and the camera would be pointing this way. So I always balance statically and neutrally with the camera pointing that way. If you're goofy, you'd be pointing the opposite direction, right? And that's because then, neutrally, if I let go of the sled, it just floats here in space, which means the volt is gonna use the least amount of power to keep this thing vertical and keep the horizon flat. So that's always just an added recommendation I have when it comes to balancing the sled as a whole. And that about covers it when it comes to troubleshooting the Steadicam Axis Volt. Now, if there's anything I did not cover in this video, please leave me a comment down below or reach out to me on Instagram at halfasiansensation, and then I can probably do a follow-up video on this. If there's anything else, then I do recommend reaching out to the Steadicam service department, as they'll be best equipped to help you out with anything else that you might be dealing with. So until next time.